For decades, one of the most famous stories in extinction science was completely wrong, and almost nobody found out until it was already printed in books, repeated in documentaries, and taught as settled fact. The story goes like this. There's a tree on the island of Mauritius that can only grow from seed if that seed first passes through the gut of a dodo, meaning when the dodo went extinct, the tree was doomed to slowly disappear right along with it. It's a beautiful, tragic story about how deeply connected two species can be. It is also, according to the actual botanists who tested it properly, mostly untrue. And that mistake is the perfect place to start today, because we're not just asking what these animals looked like. We're asking a harder, more interesting question. If 7 extinct animals came back right now, what would actually change ecologically, practically, immediately, based on real science, not movie logic? Some of the answers are hopeful. One of them might already be helping fight climate change if it were still around. One of them is tied to a fruit sitting in your kitchen right now that may have literally been built for an animal that no longer exists to eat it. Let's start by fixing that dodo story properly, because the real version is actually more interesting than the myth. In 1977, a researcher named Stanley Temple proposed that the tambalacoke tree, sometimes nicknamed the dodo tree, absolutely required passage through a dodo's digestive system for its thick seed coat to wear down enough to germinate. To test it, he force-fed tambalacoke seeds to 17 turkeys, since turkeys also grind food using small stones in their gizzard, similar to how a dodo likely would have. 10 of those seeds survived the trip through the turkey and came out the other end. He planted them, and 3 actually sprouted. Temple published this as proof. The dodo's extinction was directly causing the tree's extinction too. The story spread everywhere, showing up in major nature books for decades afterward. Here's the myth-busting part. Temple's experiment had a critical flaw baked in from the start. He never planted a comparison group of seeds that hadn't passed through a bird at all. When other researchers finally ran that missing control test, the results were clear. Seeds germinate just fine without ever touching a dodo. In fact, an earlier 1941 study had already shown this exact result, decades before Temple's paper, and it simply got overlooked. On top of that, forestry records showed tambalacoke trees on the island that were less than 100 years old, meaning the species had clearly kept reproducing long after the dodo disappeared. So if it wasn't the dodo, what was actually helping this tree survive for so long? More recent research points to 2 very different extinct and endangered animals. Giant Mauritius tortoises, which are now extinct on the island, and native fruit bats, which are still hanging on today, but just barely. Here's the version of the what-if question we can actually answer honestly. If the giant tortoises that used to eat and disperse tambalacoke-free fruit were still around in large numbers, the tree probably wouldn't be one of the most endangered plants on the entire island right now. The dodo was never really the hero of this particular story. It just got the credit because it was the more famous face of Mauritius's extinction, even though the real ecological gap left behind was from a giant, lumbering tortoise almost nobody talks about. Now let's ask the biggest, most literally impactful what-if on this entire list, because this one connects to something happening on the planet right now, not just an old ecosystem. What if woolly mammoths were still alive today? For most of the Ice Age, huge stretches of the Arctic weren't covered in the soggy, mossy tundra you'd picture today. They were covered in something scientists call the mammoth steppe, dry, open, productive grassland, similar in function to Africa's savannas, stretching across Siberia, Alaska, and northern Europe. Here's the key mechanism, and it's simpler than you'd expect. Grazing animals like mammoths didn't just live on that grassland. Research suggests they helped actively maintain it by trampling down moss and shrubs, knocking over trees before forests could take hold, and constantly churning and fertilizing the soil with their waste, keeping the ecosystem locked in a grass-dominated state, instead of shifting toward the mossy tundra and scattered trees we see there now. Here's why that detail actually matters today, and it's not just an academic curiosity. Grassland ecosystems reflect more sunlight than dark tree-covered ground, and grass root systems help keep permafrost, the frozen layer of soil beneath the surface, colder and more stable. Permafrost currently holds an enormous amount of trapped carbon and methane, and as it thaws, some of that gets released into the atmosphere, adding to warming. There's an active, real research and conservation effort in Siberia called Pleistocene Park, where scientists are deliberately reintroducing large grazing animals, bison, horses, and other big herbivores, specifically to test whether recreating mammoth steppe-style grazing pressure can help keep permafrost colder and more stable. Early results have shown areas managed this way running measurably colder than untouched, ungrazed tundra nearby. If mammoths themselves were still part of that picture, actively knocking down trees, packing down snow, and churning the ground the way only an animal that size really can, the ecosystem engineering effect would likely be stronger than what horses and bison alone can manage. This isn't a fantasy scenario. It's a real, ongoing experiment, testing an idea with a mammoth-shaped hole directly in the middle of it. Let's move to the animal on this list. That's the hardest one to think about clearly, because unlike everything else here, it didn't go extinct in some distant geological age. It went extinct in 1936, within a time frame that means someone's actual grandparent could have been alive to hear about it in the news. What if the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger, never disappeared? Thylacines were the largest carnivorous marsupial of recent times, filling a niche in the Australian and Tasmanian ecosystem roughly similar to a mid-sized wolf. They were hunted aggressively after being blamed, largely unfairly according to later analysis, for livestock deaths that were probably caused mostly by wild dogs and poor farming practices instead. Here's the ecological gap their extinction actually left behind. Tasmania currently has a documented overpopulation problem with introduced species and an imbalance in its native small to mid-sized prey animals, partly because a mid-level predator that used to help regulate those populations simply isn't there anymore. If thylacines were still present today, functioning the way healthy mid-level predators do in ecosystems worldwide, they would likely be helping control that same imbalance right now, rather than researchers needing to manage it through other, more artificial means. Here's what makes this one different from every other animal on this list. And it's not just science. There have been unconfirmed but persistent sighting reports in remote parts of Tasmania for decades since the species was declared extinct. None scientifically verified, but frequent enough that it's never fully closed as a topic the way most extinctions eventually are. And there's a real, currently active de-extinction project specifically targeting this species, using preserved genetic material and marsupial reproductive technology that's reportedly further along than several other de-extinction efforts happening right now. This isn't really a hypothetical what if, so much as a what's actually being worked on right now question with a realistic timeline attached to it. Let's go from the most recent extinction on this list to one of the strangest, most under-the-radar ecological ripple effects in the entire animal kingdom, hiding in your kitchen right now. What if giant ground sloths were still alive? These were massive, slow-moving herbivores, some species reaching the size of a small elephant that lived across the Americas until roughly the end of the last ice age. Here's the theory that connects them directly to something you've probably eaten this month. Avocados have a single enormous seed, far too large for almost any modern animal to swallow whole and disperse the way fruit-eating animals normally spread seeds around a landscape. Researchers Dan Jansen and Paul Martin proposed back in 1982 that avocados, along with several other large-seeded fruits found across the Americas, likely evolved specifically to be eaten whole by massive Ice Age megafauna, ground sloths among them, who could swallow the giant seed, walk for miles, and deposit it somewhere new in a pile of natural fertilizer. This idea is often called an evolutionary anachronism, meaning a trait that made complete sense for the animal it evolved alongside, but has been left stranded, still present, in a modern world where that specific animal no longer exists to use it properly. It's important to stay honest about where the science actually stands here. This remains a genuinely debated hypothesis, not settled fact, since large seeds can serve other purposes too, but it's taken seriously enough that it shows up regularly in real ecological research. Here's the what-if answer worth sitting with. If ground sloths still existed, avocados likely wouldn't need human cultivation to spread the way they currently do. They'd have a natural disperser again, doing on a much larger scale exactly what humans currently do by farming and shipping them, except this version would have been running quietly on its own for millions of years, with no orchards, no trucks, and no ground sloth ever asking for credit. Now let's talk about scale, because this next animal existed in numbers that are genuinely difficult to picture accurately. What if passenger pigeons never went extinct? At their peak, passenger pigeon flocks were large enough to block out the sun for hours as they passed overhead, with total population estimates in the billions, potentially the single most abundant bird species that has ever existed on the planet. Mass commercial hunting and rapid habitat destruction collapsed that population within just a few decades, and the very last individual, a bird named Martha, died in a Cincinnati zoo in 1914. Here's the honest, slightly uncomfortable version of this particular what-if, because it's genuinely more complicated than most of the others on this list. Flocks of that unimaginable size didn't just eat food. They reshaped entire forest ecosystems around them, stripping nuts and seeds from huge areas of land in a single pass, and their droppings alone were dense and heavy enough in concentrated roosting areas to damage or kill trees outright. Modern agriculture, modern forestry, and the specific shape of Eastern North American ecosystems today have all developed for over a century in a world that simply doesn't include a bird capable of that kind of impact anymore. Bringing passenger pigeons back at anything close to their historical population size wouldn't be a simple, purely feel-good restoration story. It would mean reintroducing an ecological force capable of reshaping forests and farmland at a scale nothing currently alive is prepared for. Which is exactly why current real conservation efforts working toward passenger pigeon de-extinction are approaching reintroduction slowly and cautiously, rather than aiming to just recreate those history book flocks all at once. Let's shift from a bird to a predator, because this next what if is really a straightforward competition question. What if Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat, still hunted today? Smilodon was one of the most formidable Ice Age predators, built with massive shoulders, powerful forelimbs, and canine teeth up to 7 inches long, adapted for taking down large, heavily built prey like ancient bison and ground sloths. Here's the direct, honest answer to how it would actually fare in a modern ecosystem. Smilodon's entire body was a specialized tool built for a specific job, ambushing and grappling with genuinely massive prey at relatively close range, not the long, sustained chases that many modern predators like wolves rely on instead. With most of its original oversized prey animals, mammoths, ground sloths, ancient bison species, already extinct, a modern Smilodon would likely be forced to compete directly with wolves, mountain lions, and bears for a much narrower range of available prey. Animals generally smaller than what its entire body plan was originally optimized to hunt. It's a genuinely interesting evolutionary mismatch to consider. An apex predator perfectly built for a world that no longer exists, dropped into a modern ecosystem that's already fully occupied by other predators that adapted to exactly these conditions instead. And for our final animal, let's talk about a predator most people have simply never heard of, despite it being one of the most successful apex predators in its entire region's history. What if terror birds still existed? Terror birds, technically called forest wrasses, were flightless, carnivorous birds that stood as tall as a person or taller, with massive hooked beaks built for delivering powerful, precise strikes to bring down prey, functioning as apex predators across South America for millions of years, with at least one species even making it across into North America before eventually going extinct. Here's the direct what-if answer for this one too. A modern terror bird would be entering an ecosystem already fully staffed, with large established predators, wolves, big cats, bears, depending on the specific region, all of them adapted to modern prey species and modern competition in ways a terror bird's ancient body plan and hunting strategy never had to account for. Unlike Smilodon, which at least shares some general ambush predator logic with living big cats, a giant flightless predatory bird represents such a genuinely different hunting strategy that it's difficult to predict exactly how it would fit in, or even whether fit in is the right way to think about it at all. Sometimes the honest answer to a what-if question isn't a clean, satisfying prediction. Sometimes it's simply, nothing alive today is built quite like this animal was, so we genuinely don't have a clean comparison to make the prediction with. So here's what all 7 of these what-if scenarios actually have in common. Once you step back and look at the full list together, a tree that never actually needed the animal it became famous for needing, while the real disperser, a giant tortoise, quietly vanished with almost no attention at all. A grazing giant that might currently be helping slow permafrost thaw, if only it were still doing the job. A predator that went extinct recently enough that its ecological absence is still actively visible today. A fruit sitting in kitchens worldwide that may be quietly waiting for an animal that's never coming back to actually eat it the way it evolved to be eaten. A bird whose sheer numbers would make its return genuinely complicated, not simply heartwarming. And 2 predators whose comeback stories would mostly involve trying and likely struggling to fit into a world that already filled in the space they left behind. None of this is really about bringing monsters back to life. It's about noticing that extinction doesn't just remove an animal from a family photo. It quietly removes a job that animal was doing, sometimes one that's still empty and waiting right now, for something else to fill it, whether that ends up being a living tortoise, a herd of grazing horses, or if some of the real research happening today keeps moving forward, eventually the actual animal itself.